In just 24 hours, we have seen back-to-back attacks against Jewish people around the world. This is what happens when anti-Semitism has become normalized, excused, and even cheered on. This is what a global intifada looks like. Once they're done with the Jews, they will come for everyone else. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Off the Record. This week, we unfortunately have very tragic and heavy news to cover, although it's been feeling like we've had to do that for over 2 years now. I'm Zina Rachamilova, and as we record this, it's been one full day since the horrific shooting terror attack at Bondi Beach in Sydney, Australia. On the very first night of Chanukah, instead of celebrating the holiday with joy, unity, and Jewish pride, Jews all over the world were forced to watch as members of our community had to run for their lives and hide, were hunted down by radical, hateful gunmen. 2 terrorists opened fire at a Chanukah gathering at Bondi Beach near Sydney, Australia. The attackers were a father and a son, a 50-year-old man and a 24-year-old son. Navid Akram, the son, was critically injured and is now in police custody, while his father was shot and killed by the police. So far, the total number of casualties stands at 15 people, including a Chabad rabbi, Rabbi Eli Schlanger, who served as the assistant rabbi of the Chabad chapter at Bondi Beach. He was a father of 5 and had just recently celebrated the birth of his youngest son, who was only 2 months old. Rabbi Schlanger had actually written a letter to the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese following Australia's recognition of a Palestinian state. In that letter, he had warned the Prime Minister about rising anti-Semitism in the country and pleaded with him not to turn his back on Australia's Jewish community. According to Chabad, Rabbi Schlanger did so much to commemorate the victims of the October 7th massacre and was known by many as someone who deeply cared about the security of Jewish people around the world. The list of the victims also includes Dan Elkayam, a 27-year-old French Jewish engineer who had been traveling the world for several years and was known for his love of nature, football, and Jewish communal life. He had come to Bondi Beach to participate in the first night of Chanukah celebrations. Other victims include Alexander Kleitman, who was a Holocaust survivor, and a girl named Matilda, who was only 10 years old. ILTV will continue to update as we learn more about the victims. Unfortunately, this vicious terror attack at Bondi Beach was not an isolated incident. In just 24 hours, we have seen back-to-back attacks against Jewish people around the world. At Brown University, 2 students were murdered by a shooter who had come in during a final exam review and opened fire in a professor's classroom that also happens to teach Jewish studies. In California, a gunman fired 20 bullets into a Jewish family's home, reportedly because they had displayed Chanukah decorations outside of their home. And in Amsterdam, an anti-Semitic mob set off smoke bombs at a Chanukah festival. All of this happened in the span of 24 hours. It has now become open season on Jews. This is not random. This is not disconnected. This is what happens when anti-Semitism has become normalized, excused, and even cheered on. We warned you this would happen. Now, I attended a vigil last night in Tel Aviv, spontaneously organized by a group of Olim to honor the victims of the Bondi Beach attack. What started as a last-minute gathering drew hundreds of Israelis, particularly from the Olim community, the young working-class immigrants who had moved to Israel from all over the world from their diaspora communities, especially in the wake of October 7th. Among the crowd were members of the Australian Jewish community, both those who were visiting Israel and those who have made Israel their home. Many of them spoke emotionally about the attack, especially the Australians that were simply visiting Israel and now find themselves in this unimaginable reality where this tragedy had struck back in their home and was affecting their loved ones. One Australian said something that deeply resonated with me about the unique way Chanukah is celebrated in Australia. For most Jews around the diaspora and for all of us in Israel, Chanukah falls in the winter. So we're used to lighting candles indoors, at home, with some family and a few close friends. But In Australia, Chanukah is actually in the summertime, so Jewish life actually spills outdoors. People gather in parks, at beaches, and in these large public celebrations. Chabad in particular had always organized Chanukah events in the open spaces, in especially iconic spaces like Bondi Beach, which is one of the places that is considered part of Australian Jewish life. Celebrating Chanukah there isn't just tradition, it's synonymous with the Australian way of Jewish life. And hearing this made it painfully clear just how targeted and violating this attack was. The terrorists didn't just come to attack random people. They attacked a symbol, an identity, and a sacred communal space. Let's watch a couple clips from the memorial from last night.
When I talk about Chanukah in Australia is that it's summer in Australia. Chanukah is a summer holiday. So it's not this festival where you gather inside and around candles with your family. It's actually a festival where you go out and you go with your friends and you go into these large community events. In Melbourne, where I grew up, Chabad always put on Chanukah in the park. It was one of the biggest events of the year. And you'd all go out and you'd stay out till late, and it was a festival of, of summer and happiness. And in Sydney, it was Chanukah on the beach, on Bondi Beach, that iconic spot, synonymous with Australia. That it doesn't get more iconic. Maybe there's the Harbour Bridge, the Sydney Opera House, and Bondi Beach. This is what it means to be in Australia. It's a place which is synonymous with the Australian way of life. And that's, I think, when I spoke to my cousins and friends today who are in Australia, it's the thing that they reflected on. This has come to our way of life. It's something which we never expected. The Australian community never expected for this awful terrorism, this antisemitism to come for our very way of life, the Australian way of life. The Australian Jewish community is, by and large, a community of Holocaust survivors. There have been Jews in Australia since the very first white settlement back in 1788, the first fleet, but by and large, the majority of the Jewish community in Australia arrived, as my grandparents did, after the Holocaust. And basically, the sentiment was, we want to get as far away from the anti-Semitism of the old world of Europe as we possibly can. It doesn't get much further than Australia. So they left wanting to escape that. And for 50, 60, 70, 80 years, that was largely true. And when we grew up, we thought we were the blessed Jews. We were the ones who didn't have to deal with all that. And unfortunately, the last few years have shown us that isn't quite true. All of Australian society, the vast majority of Australians are horrified by what happened today. And that is the part of Australian society that we want to emphasize. The majority of Australians, including those heroic people who apprehended the terrorists, those are the Australians we want to put forward. That's the kind of Australia we want to reclaim. It's that larrikin attitude, that laid-back attitude, and the idea that everyone deserves a fair go.
There was also a father from Bondi Beach who happened to be in Israel and came to speak to us. As he told us that his wife and children were safe, he broke down crying. He was overwhelmed by the vigil itself and by seeing all of these Jewish olim, immigrants from all over the world, all standing together in solidarity with his community. And that's what struck me the most, is that as they were painfully processing everything, all these Australian Jews were saying, thank God for the state of Israel. Over and over, they said it. They were deeply moved to see Jews from all over the world showing up, sharing in their pain, and supporting them. It was a powerful reminder of who we are as a people, our shared pain, and our deep responsibility to one another. Watching how comforted they were, and just knowing that Jews outside of Australia cared so deeply was incredibly emotional for them. And it stayed with me in the midst of all this trauma, that their instinct was gratitude for the existence of a Jewish state. And that should say everything. Israel plays a critical role in not just protecting Israelis, but Jews from all over the world. That's because Israel's enemies don't see this as a war against one single country. They see it as a war against Jewish people everywhere. And this is why Jewish institutions and places of worship worldwide often fall under the protective reach of Israel's security services, including the Mossad and the Shin Bet. And this is why Israel's National Security Council has issued repeated warnings to Jews and Israelis abroad, urging vigilance and caution, especially in unsecure public gatherings. Now, according to an Israeli official, Israel had repeatedly warned Australian authorities about hostile intentions to target Jewish sites on their soil. Clearly, those warnings were not taken seriously. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu attacked the Australian government and described anti-Semitism in Australia as a cancer. He had said that leaders who remained silent were complicit in letting the circumstances evolve towards that incident.
Anti-Semitism is a cancer. It spreads when leaders stay silent. It retreats when leaders act.
Netanyahu, too, wrote a letter to the Australian Prime Minister a few months ago and said that the policy they took on recognizing a Palestinian state adds fuel to the anti-Semitic fire and encourages Jew hatred running rampant on Australia's streets.
I wrote, "Your call for a Palestinian state pours fuel on the anti-Semitic fire. It rewards Hamas terrorism. It emboldens those who menace Australian Jews and encourages the Jew hatred now stalking your streets."
A senior security official says that in recent months, there's been increased activity by the Iranian regime to orchestrate attacks against Israeli and Jewish targets around the world. Now, it's no secret that the regime in Iran has a long history of targeting Jews and Israelis worldwide. There was the 1992 bombing at the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, where a Hezbollah suicide bomber killed 29 civilians, and the blast caused the embassy building to collapse along with a nearby church, school, and apartment building. 2 years after that attack, a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires was targeted in another suicide attack, killing 85 people and making it the deadliest terror attack in Argentina's history. It was only in April of 2024, Argentina's second highest court found that the Iranian regime had masterminded the bombings. They said that the regime in Iran directed the attack and that Hezbollah carried them out. That ruling also characterized Iran as a terrorist state. The regime was also responsible for the 2012 Burgas bombing in Bulgaria, where a suicide bomber detonated himself inside a bus that was carrying 42 Israeli tourists, most of them young people arriving on a flight from Tel Aviv. The explosion killed the Bulgarian bus driver and 5 other Israelis. Israeli officials say that there's no doubt that the direction and infrastructure for the attack at Bondi Beach originated in Tehran. The Israeli intelligence source said that in recent months, there has been a marked increase in activity by the regime in Iran and its proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, aimed at carrying out attacks against Israeli and Jewish targets worldwide. The source added that this included Australia, where following specific intelligence warnings, the government took partial measures against the Iranian embassy, including the expulsion of the ambassador.
A short time ago, we informed the Iranian ambassador to Australia that he would be expelled.
Now, unfortunately, this isn't anything new. Nobody's surprised. The Iranian regime has spent decades targeting Jews and Western interests around the world, and I wouldn't put it past something like them to attempt something like this again. But while the regime in Iran pulled the strings, I hold the international community accountable for what comes next. For over 2 years now, after the Islamist regimes in Iran and its terror proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis showed the world exactly who they were, most clearly on October 7th of 2023, the global response has been a moral failure. Yes, Israel had your support for a few weeks, but it didn't take long before that support turned into condemnations of the Jewish state for defending itself against a war it never started. You allowed openly anti-Semitic and anti-Western mobs to flood your streets. You turned a blind eye as vile hatred against Jews and the West was normalized. You allowed those same mobs to infiltrate your universities, and when those mobs called to globalize the Intifada, your leaders were asked one very simple question on whether or not calling for the genocide of Jews violate the university code of conduct. And the answer we always heard was, it depends on the context. An Intifada is not a slogan. It's not some form of resistance. It's not a simple uprising. It's a call to massacre Jews through violence. And you allowed that call to be made unchecked, unpunished, and normalized. You failed to hold the people accountable for spreading terror rhetoric. You legitimized it on your campuses. You legitimized it in public discourse. And then you watched the consequences of it unfold. We already watched how an Israeli couple was gunned down in Washington, D.C. in the name of a free Palestine. We watched an elderly woman, also a Holocaust survivor, being murdered in Colorado simply for attending a walk to support the release of Jewish hostages. And now, once again, on a Jewish holiday, we watched Jews gunned down and massacred. This is what a global intifada looks like. And if you don't care because the victims are Jews, then pay attention, because it never stops with us. Once they're done with the Jews, they will come for everyone else. So I hold you accountable. The politicians, the institutions, the media, the academics, you are the ones who normalized violent rhetoric. We told you what an intifada was on October 7th. Hamas showed you who they were. They filmed it, they broadcasted it, and they used their own civilians as human shields. They looted aid, they hid the food, they manufactured starvation, and you still chose appeasement. Because of your cowardice, because of your refusal to confront radical Islamism, people are dead. Unfortunately, this will not be the last attack like these that we see against Jews. But throughout history, throughout the pogroms, massacres, and expulsions, there is one crucial difference today. For the first time in modern history, there is a Jewish state, there is a Jewish army, and there is a Jewish peoplehood that'll never go down quietly again. This will not be the first time someone tries to massacre Jews, but it'll be the last time that they think that we won't fight back. Thank you for joining us today on Off the Record, and may the memories of all the victims be a blessing, and may we see better days ahead.